Chapter 1, Praying for Forgiveness. Aftermath. The Wizard. The snow was stained a violent red, and Theron's boots crunched with each step as the sun began to slowly set behind the mountains on his left. The first dark was almost on them. The soft shadows of the trees and the roots became long like outstretched fingers. In front of him were the remains of the caravan and the aftermath of the battle that had begun to end in the last few minutes. He could smell burning flesh and wood. He could still hear the occasional clang of sword on sword or a cry of pain, a scream for mercy, a call for a mother. "For this black path I tread in your eternal name," he muttered under his breath as he walked. To his left was the looming mountain, spotted with pines that grew tall and stretched into the sky. To his right was the edge of the road that dropped sharply into the valley below, where the trees and rocks spread out like flowers in a field as the shadow of night started to overtake it. Before him and behind him was the long caravan of over a dozen wagons that were all headed for the city of Portus. Wagons of the enemy. He felt a sudden hand around his ankle as he sauntered down the road. He looked down at the face of a young soldier, his silver armor and black beard stained with crimson. Theron gave him a long look and a tilt of his head. He studied the soldier's face. He remembered when he himself looked like him. He remembered being young and ambitious and hungry for glory. This soldier would never have that. "Please," the soldier cried out, leaving a bloody handprint on Theron's trousers as his hand fell to the snow. "Mercy." "I am forgiven," Theron replied coldly, continuing his prayer. He killed the soldier with a dagger to the throat and walked away to the sound of the bubbling and gurgling death that caught in the man's throat. "For the unending empire and broken throne reclaimed," he picked up where he left off. Crunch. 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 He left a trail of his mercy behind him. Around him, the caravan they had attacked was now in flames. His soldiers were moving swiftly along its flanks, wagon to wagon, in search of their target. The mission was almost complete. "I am forgiven." He watched some of his soldiers drag an elderly couple out of one of the caravans. "Please, no, please," the woman cried out in a shrill voice. "Mercy, mercy for my wife," the old man begged. Theron saw both of them die from his peripheral as he headed to the back of the column. "For Queen and Mother, I give myself to enemies' wills," he sighed under his breath, closing his eyes momentarily as he spoke. He looked up at the white sky, now turning dark, as the snow fell softly on his face. He closed his eyes, feeling the tickle of the snowfall. For a moment, he was a young boy in rain again. "I am forgiven." "For homelands that call to me to rest upon her hills," he spoke aloud once more, following the column. He came to a black wagon that was pocked with dents and slash marks. At the base of the wagon's entry were the crippled bodies of several Rainian soldiers. He tapped his sword on the window and heard some cries from within. This had to be them. "I am forgiven. For the malady I feel in me with every tired breath." He produced a flame in his hand as he approached the wagon door. The door was painted a shiny black that reflected a distorted version of himself back at him. He felt the warmth of the magic spread through his veins. It was intoxicating to feel that power. He was a master of fire. He was a soldier of rain. "I am forgiven." He reached for the door handle and heard crying from within. "And for every soul I take for you that knows my name is death." He turned the handle and pulled. He never got to the last line of the poem. When he opened the wagon door, what he found inside was a young girl no older than 14 and her younger brother. She was shielding him with her arms, her cloak walling them both off. The boy was no older than 10. She was scared, he could see it, but she was also fierce, with a wild look in her eyes as if challenging Theron to step closer. All of this he gathered in a moment, because the moment the door flew open, she dropped her cloak to reveal a crossbow, and a crossbow bolt pierced him in the chest near the shoulder. Theron had only but a moment to feel the pain before the boy started to scream, a screech unlike any he had ever heard. His eardrums twitched in pain, and in moments, Theron's mind was invaded. He felt a searing pain enter his skull. There was no doubt. The boy was the target. Theron fell to his knees as the blinding pain crippled him. He dropped his dagger and clutched his face as pain overtook him in both body and mind. His vision blurred as he felt the trickle of blood in his armor, and it all went white. He saw himself. No, he saw the boy. He was the boy. He saw glimpses of the young boy's life as if looking through his eyes, orchards and petals falling to the floor, laughing with his sister by the lake, running through lavish halls and getting his first sword. He heard his name called. Kit Vandren. And his sister was Rhea. The visions became a blur. Now they were more recent. He saw Kit crying in the middle of the night, the things in his room floating off the floor. He watched as, in another vision, Kit set a tree on fire by touching it. Theron could see this boy was powerful. Far too powerful for someone so young. In another twisting blur, he watched the boy set off with the caravan. He saw the caravan attacked. He saw his family die. He saw Theron opening the door. Then his vision went white again. But something else came over Theron. He felt a sense of longing and peace as the family set off for the capital. He felt safe until he didn't. And Theron didn't feel the wrath of the gods in the boy like he had been told to believe. He didn't sense danger. He didn't sense evil. But he felt fear. He felt desperation. And right now, all the boy could feel was the urge to flee. Theron screamed and howled in pain. He couldn't see, but he felt the two children push past him out the door. He heard the shouts of his soldiers as the boy got farther and farther away. His vision returned. He was on his hands and knees, gasping for air, staring at the ground that was now covered in his own blood. And the strangest thing of all, he felt tears running down his cheeks and falling into the snow-laden ground. In that moment, only a single thought entered Theron's mind. I am forgiven. What have I done? Chapter 2. Home. The mission. On the road again. Theron felt a sigh of relief when he broke the tree line and crested the hill. His shoulders dropped. The armor he wore weighed on him, but seeing these familiar lands, he felt the weight lift suddenly. He could see the fields and farms extending beyond the horizon like a blanket. He could just make out the silhouettes of the palace and the spire on the horizon, and the walls that called to him. Just above it all was the great celestial body, Alterian, though the Eldari called it Calith. The moon, Oris, was off to its right today, far off in the distance. He was almost home. His horse neighed as if sensing his thoughts. I know, Snow, he spoke softly to her, patting her roughly on the side of her neck. She closed her eyes in response to his touch. We're almost there. With his heels, he spurred Snow down the hill. Theron heard the clinking of armor as the rest of his team followed closely behind, now passing through the forest. They began to chatter amongst themselves, finally letting their guards down after crossing familiar borders. He started to sing a song. The rest of his team picked up on it, and soon all 100 horses were clopping along with the song filling the air. "And we're coming home," he sang loudly. "Home to where the trees grow tall and the willow calls and calls and calls." He heard them all clap in unison once, twice, 3 times. "And we're coming home," he continued softer now. His voice fell out of the chorus, but nobody noticed. Theron and his company passed expansive fields where farmers waved to the company of weary soldiers as they passed. A few of his company waved back. They found themselves near the outskirts of the city by the main gate. The town that had sprung up outside the walls was just as curious of the soldiers, though it was more in hushed voices and stares. They passed the ancient stone walls, walls that had stood for thousands of years long before the country of Alara rose. These were the walls of the firstlings. Though the capital city was now long gone, the bones of the Kingdom of Rain were as strong as ever. Passing through the gate, the sun was blocked out by the massive spire that rose from the center of the city, casting a great shadow on Theron. The main street into the city was paved with stone buildings and potted greenery. The cobblestone streets were cracked and old, and the city itself seemed to have learned to live with the earth that was slowly trying to reclaim its place. At the end of the long street was the large, square-like palace, painted in black. With his company, he passed down the street, down the market square, beyond the interior walls of the city, and into the royal district. And he was home. "Welcome home, soldiers of Rain," he heard the officer call out across the throne room. The soldiers remained quiet, as was custom. They all bowed their heads lower. Theron counted the tiles on the floor. He counted the moments until he could go home. He counted the seconds until he could sleep in his own bed once more. "You have done well in service of our great and lasting kingdom," the High Constable spoke. The Queen was not in this room as usual, not that the troops noted her absence. Most assumed she had more important things to do. "The Great Mother has protected you and guided you back home." "We seek forgiveness for our sins," the soldiers called out, still kneeling before the throne, their voices echoing off the marble walls. "You are forgiven," the High Constable spoke. Theron hated their voice. He hated the shrill, nasally nature of this would-be soldier who commanded so much respect and knew nothing of the sacrifices that his company had made. He doubted the High Constable had ever been in battle, let alone ever lifted a sword. The clack, clack, clack of the High Constable's staff echoed as he paced in front of the throne. "We are forgiven," they replied in unison. Theron rose with the others. He watched the hunched shape of the High Constable Malik stare back at them, scrutinizing them. Theron could see he was preparing to speak. "They're sending us out again," he thought to himself, feeling the pit in his stomach grow. He ached to rest, but he put the thought out of mind. A good soldier does what needs doing. "The Queen, in her wisdom, has asked that you, the forgiven of the Black Company, ride out once more," Malik spoke. It was followed by a silence that permeated the halls. Theron could feel the weight of the glances at his back. His soldiers were tired. He was tired. "There is a caravan crossing near the Calanthian Pass. Within this caravan we have received word that not only will there be a long list of nobles of many houses, but among them a tainted soul." There was some murmuring. "The Queen asks that you purge them," the constable finished. "When would you have us ride?" Theron asked, his voice feeling foreign to himself in this room. "At first light," Malik replied. "The caravan is already moving, and you must make haste if you are to catch them at the pass." "Resistance?" Theron asked. "They are traveling with an escort of approximately 200 armed Imperial soldiers, however, be prepared for more." 200 troops? Maybe more, all for one mage? Theron asked, raising his eyebrows. "This tainted," Malik corrected, "is important. We are not sure why, but if they are being guarded so well..." Malik paused as he walked up face to Theron, who stared back at him without emotion. "All the more reason that they don't arrive in Portus, wouldn't you agree, Captain?" Theron nodded and said no more. "Make no mistake. The army that travels with them must be crushed. But your priority is the noble families they are protecting, and most of all, the tainted," Theron said softly. "The tainted," Malik continued, apparently not having heard Theron or choosing to ignore him. "You will see the will of the Great Mother done. In the name of the Queen." He tapped his staff on the ground with a resounding echo. The troops immediately stood at attention and spoke in unison. "The Great Mother speaks. The forgiven bleed." Then there was silence once more. "Good. Welcome home, forgiven," Malik began. "And we cannot wait to welcome you home victorious once more," he finished. Theron didn't know it yet, but he would never again lay eyes on his home. Chapter 3. The Siblings. In the Shadows. Are we there yet? The road was bumpy, and Rhea was beginning to feel nauseated from the trip. Her brother, on the other hand, was staring eagerly out at the snow-covered hills that stretched out below them. The road they were on snaked along the mountainside like a great dragon, and the hills fell away steeply beyond it. How far, in fact, was hard to determine, as a fresh layer of snow had covered the land last night, and they awoke to a chill in the air that had already slowed them. Outside, Rhea could hear the rhythmic marching of troops in armor bearing the great red cloaks of Alara. She wondered if they hated her for traveling inside the comfort of the caravan along with the others. But if they hated her, she pondered, surely they wouldn't be here to protect her. No, she surmised, they were proud to march for them. They were proud to suffer on this road if it meant protecting her family. Rhea Vandren was one of more than a dozen families making the trip to Portus today. Most were making their way to the city for the Festival of Long Nights, a winter festival that was celebrated annually. If her calculations were correct, they would be there in only a few days, and in time for the rising sun. Already more than halfway there. She was 14 now, a young lady, and she was excited to spend time in the courts. Most of all, she was excited to see the house of the ethereal court, the real reason they were on the road. It is said that the ethereal court resided inside the mountain that loomed over the city of Portus. She had heard that the mages lived inside the mountain and bathed in hot springs and spent their afternoons reading books and learning spells. How lovely. Her brother was almost 9 now, and for the past 2 months, he had begun to show the telltale signs of a budding mage. She was a bit jealous, but as long as she got to spend her days in the court, she didn't mind. Her heart was elated at the thought of wearing her best dresses and attending balls, and, "Are we there yet?" Her brother broke the silence. "Kit," she sighed. "I've told you a million times now, this is a long trip." "I know," he huffed. "We have to be getting close, right? The sun's been out for days," he pouted. "Almost, and the first dark is almost here. We have to make it through that, and then we're home," she added simply. Kit turned back to his window and remained silent once more. She watched him curiously, the way his dark hair curled at the ends so wildly. How could someone so young demand so much attention? She had seen him do strange things with his magic, sure, but surely that was normal? Though she hadn't met many mages, and certainly none so young as Kit. "Almost there, young sir," he heard a voice break through. Killian had apparently heard as he passed and slowed his horse to match their wagon. He looked glorious and handsome in his shining armor. The red cloak billowed, and she could see a little snow had gathered on his shoulders and in his hair. His face was flushed, his cheeks and nose red from the cold. "Not far now," he added with a warm smile. "Would you like my mittens?" Rhea offered him, running a hand through her golden hair, now wishing she had had a moment to freshen up. "No, my lady," he replied with a slow nod. "Not unless you happen to have some rum or whiskey tucked away in there," he jested. She laughed and blushed. Gods, he was handsome. "No, sorry, Sir Killian," she said a little quieter. One day, she'd be old enough to marry a knight like him. "We'll be there soon." He gave her a final smile, and with a flick of the reins, the horse galloped off ahead, leaving a mist of snow and warm breath in the air. She looked back at her brother, who was still pouting and staring out the window on his side. She remembered when, only a few weeks ago, Kit had fallen into a strange fit of madness in the middle of the night. They had found him hovering outside his window 3 stories from the ground, and below him, at least 100 stray cats and dogs had gathered to watch. Not even a week later, they were walking along their lands when a bandit tried to rob them around mid-dark. He had snuck up on them and held Kit at knife point. Their parents had watched horrified when Kit suddenly burst into tears, and seconds later, the bandit slit his own throat. Kit wailed for what felt like hours, covering the man's blood. Rhea shivered at the memories. It was easy to forget how powerful Kit was becoming when he acted so normal. So here they were on their way to Portus, to the ethereal court, home of the grandest school of mages in Alara, where he would hopefully learn to control his powers. She wondered which of the paths he would choose, and whether he would serve in the military as a battle mage and become famous like in the old stories when the great mages fought against the demigods. Or perhaps he would live a life in the courts as an advisor to some distant king. She grew sad at the idea of being away from her brother, but so immensely proud of him. The idea thrilled her, but it made her feel so normal in comparison. And here he was, sitting beside her as if nothing had happened, as if they were on some vacation in a far-off land. Instead, they were being accompanied by hundreds of troops and dozens of noble houses on what was probably the coldest winter in a long time. Or at least it felt like it to her. "Do you think they'll like me?" Kit finally asked. Rhea peeled her eyes away from the empty seats across from them. She eyed the cushions and the stitching, thinking before she finally spoke. "I think they will be proud to have you, and one day, you might even sit on the council." She smiled at him, bumping him with her shoulder. "They have lots of mages in the court," he retorted. "Perhaps." There was a moment of silence before she locked eyes with him. "But not Evandrin. And none so young as you," she winked. He blushed a little. Just beyond him, the horizon was growing darker. The sun was setting and would not rise again for many days. On top of that, the sky looked as if they were in for more snow tonight. "That's what I'm afraid of." He stared at his lap now. She couldn't imagine what he was feeling. The caravan halted suddenly. Surely we aren't there yet. Then there came a sudden sound. One that they would never forget. What sounded like thousands of voices crying out from the direction of the mountain. She heard the rushing of metal as hundreds of troops rushed around the caravan, around the carriage they were in. She heard the horns of Alara blaring and horses galloping. She peered outside for a moment to find soldiers shouting, forming lines. Descending down the rocky mountainside were the cloaked figures of innumerable warriors. Blasts of fire and lightning struck the snow in front of them. Soldiers shouted, and in seconds, a battle had erupted around their caravan. In that moment, Killian rushed back to their carriage, his face red and his breathing heavy. "Shut the windows," he said, with wide eyes. "We're under attack." That was the last time that she ever looked on the handsome face of Sir Killian. Chapter 4. For Rain, the Watch, the Ambush. They came across the caravan quickly enough. The Black Company had ridden nonstop to make it to the pass in time. They were in luck, as a heavy snowfall had slowed the Alaran caravan and had given them time to set up camp and rest. The camp was set up just behind Theron, down a small hill hidden from the road. Theron knew his troops were cold and tired, he could feel it. But they were too good at what they did to voice it. They were 56 strong, some of the best of Rain. Yet he could see the bitterness and longing for home in their faces nonetheless. Theron couldn't help but feel proud of his troops and their determination. It filled him with joy to see them so eager to face their enemies. He had seen fear in the faces of his own troops before he ever joined the Black Company, long before he was a soldier of standing in Rain. Theron ran a hand through his graying beard absent-mindedly, as he did every time before a battle. "Still no sign of more mages?" he asked his second-in-command. She stood beside him shivering, uncomplaining. Her hair was short, and there was a scar on her scalp from when he had stitched her head back up many seasons back now. She shook her head. "Just the one on horseback," she added. "Though he seems formidable. He's no match for all of us," he replied. She nodded again. "Yes, sir." There was a long pause. He turned to look at her, studying her face. "You're oddly quiet," he said simply. She didn't reply. She only stared back with her dark eyes. He had dreamed of those eyes many nights. But as a forgiven, he was not awarded the luxury of taking a wife. Such was his sacrifice in her name. He pushed the thoughts aside. "Come on, Mira, I know you well enough to know when you wish to say something. Speak freely," he said, warming his hands with his breath. "The others," she began, "they wish to go home." She let her words hang. "As do I, Mira," he sighed. "Yes, sir." She leaned on him for a moment as she repositioned, her warmth comforting him for the briefest of moments. "We do this, and we can go home," he offered. "Until when?" "When is the next time they will send us out again?" she replied a little hastily, some bite in her tone. His eyes locked on hers and she quelled, looking down sheepishly. "Sir." Theron sighed deeply. "I know," he added. "I miss my home, too." He was silent for a moment. Then he gave her a side glance, locking eyes with her with a small smile. "Tell me about your home, Mira." "I live outside the city walls," she began. "In Farmside?" "No, near Warren," she corrected. "Ah," he added, nodding. His breath created a thick fog in the air as he shivered. "I live alone with my horses." She stared at the sky. "Aaron, my horsemaster, is probably putting them in right now before the long dark." She smiled weakly. "I have a large stone hearth that I miss more than anything right now." She laughed, looking up, remembering. Theron laughed with her. "I'm sure we could all use a good warm fire right now." "I have a large dining table that has probably been used once," she continued. "You should come by sometime," she said, quieter. "I'm not much of a cook, but I would love to." He bumped her with his shoulder. He could feel the tension growing between them. He turned his gaze on the road. The scouts hadn't returned yet, and it was starting to make him nervous. "I have a cellar that is warm and dry year-round. I keep only the best there," she continued. "I even have a few bottles from some imperial vineyards." "Blasphemy," he added mockingly. He knew that most troops dreamed of tasting the wines of Alara. She laughed, her warm, melodious laugh. It was music to him in a world of noise. "We could share a bottle," she said, quieter still. "And we could drink all night." She shifted her weight, stepping just the slightest bit closer. "And eat." He felt her shoulder brush his again. He wanted so badly to put his arm around her. "And we could rise whenever we wanted," she said, leaning in, both of them looking straight ahead. "Now you're speaking fairy tales," he replied as another fog cloud appeared before them. You don't see yourself retiring ever?" "I will retire at the end of a blade, I think. Perhaps in a few hours, if I'm being honest." He looked at her for another moment. Her warm eyes stared back, haunted, wanting to say more. "I see you old and gray by a fire, reading a book," she studied him. "That sounds lovely." "We could have that, Theron," she said softly. Mira. He sighed, unsure of how to reply. Then there was the unmistakable sound of 2 horses coming up the hill. He saw their figures break through the trees as the last bit of light left the forest. The sky was still light, though not for long. Soon they would be in more than 100 hours of darkness. Mira sighed. They looked at each other for a moment before finally Theron put a hand on her shoulder and nodded. "Get ready," he said quietly. "Yes, sir." She smiled, the light in her eyes dimmed once more. "What news?" he called to the riders as they stepped in front of them. "The caravan is close. Maybe half an hour away," the rider spoke out of breath. "Good. To the camp, get warm and rouse the troops," he sighed deeply. "It's time." The black company poured down the hill like water in a river. Theron was the first to cry out as a ball of fire erupted along the line from their hands. He felt the tingling on his skin as the mages in his company fired on the Alaran lines. His troops roared and crashed on silver shields. The battlefield was now ablaze as arrows flew past. He watched as soldiers on both sides fell quickly, the clang of swords and the cry of battle filling his ears. He turned in time to see a sword coming at him and parried it sloppily. He recovered quickly, stumbling backwards, and with a few swings cut down his opponent, their blood spraying him. Another gout of flame erupted along the line as another mage torched a wagon in the caravan. Theron heard the cries of the nobles inside, their screams drowned out by the battle, but the smell of their flesh permeated along the front. "For rain!" he heard his troops call out. "For the Great Mother!" another replied. The Alarans were caught completely unawares. Within minutes, the line began to fold, and their silver armor littered the floor. Even though Theron's troops were outnumbered, the element of surprise proved too much. Theron walked over bodies, moving towards the back of the caravan. He saw bodies melted into the earth, their cloaks still on fire. One was blinking still, too far gone to feel the pain, but croaked in agony as he reached up for Theron. Theron drove his blade into his head, putting him out of his misery. In front of him, he watched one of his forgiven troops, on horseback, come to swords with a handsome knight on a horse of his own. The Alaran clearly knew what he was doing, and dispatched not 1 but 3 of Theron's troops, one after the other, before Theron caught up. "You fight well, but you will die tonight, Imperial," Theron spoke loudly across the field. The man dismounted with a smile. He seemed to relish the challenge. For a brief moment, the Alaran knight turned away, his crimson cloak towards Theron. If it had been any other soldier, the Alaran might have had him. But Theron watched as the soldier whipped around quickly and a blast of lightning arced its way towards him. He felt the sting of its heat for a mere moment, the strange smell in the air before his own hands went up and the lightning broke on his barrier, arcing away and into the trees. "Nice try," Theron called out again, his heart racing. "That was close." "What is your name?" the knight called to Theron. "Why?" Theron replied, the two pacing in front of each other as the battle erupted behind them, circling around each other like predators. "I wish to know what to put on your gravestone when I kill you," the knight replied. Theron laughed and spat on the ground. "And believe me, I will kill you," he retorted. "It will be my blade that shuts your eyes forever." "Theron is my name, soldier of Alara, though you do not need to know it." The Alaran knight smirked at him as the sky grew darker. "And what is your name?" "You can't use my joke," he retorted. "I wish to know whose parents I'll be riding home to tonight to explain how their son died bravely for jesting too much," Theron spat out. "My name is Killian Thrum, first knight of the Red Suns, and you chose the wrong battle tonight, Theron, child of rain." Killian leapt forward with a violent scream. Their swords crashed together violently. The two parried, spinning around each other. Theron slung fire at Killian Thrum, and Killian skillfully absorbed it, the flames breaking against him, nothing more than light in the growing darkness. Within those few tense exchanges, the battle continued around them as the Alaran caravan was slowly overcome. Then it was over. Killian stumbled, trying to catch himself a moment too late, and with one swift kick, Theron threw him off the road and into the canyon abyss. He watched at the edge of the battle as Killian tumbled into the darkness of the trees far below. Chapter 5. Run, run, run. Rhea held her brother's hand firmly as they dashed through the battle and into the dark. She could hear him crying, but She had to focus. Now was not the time to be afraid, even though she was. She couldn't be the scared child right now. No, she had to be the brave older sister. She pulled them through the chaos, whipping past the caravan, past the shrubs, and to the edge of the canyon. She didn't have a chance to think. She jumped with barely a glance. Her feet found a ledge. She turned and helped Kit down as she heard the shouts from the Rainian soldiers. "Come on," she whispered. "Hurry," she cooed. Another ledge. And another. "But Mother and Father," he cried, leaping down to another ledge. "Don't worry," she said, taking his face in her hands. "They will be okay. You hear me? They will." But Rhea could see the fear in his eyes. He could probably see the fear in hers that betrayed her words. "Come on," she said, steeling herself, not giving him a chance to think. They never made it to the next ledge, however. One of the stones gave way and they tumbled down the cliffside and landed about 10 feet down on their backs. Rhea stood, forcing Kit back to his feet. "Are you okay?" she asked, panting. He nodded, and a split second later an arrow struck the ground near them. "Let's go!" She climbed over the ledge, finding the next one, and the next ledge, and the next, until finally they were at least 300 feet below the flames far above them as arrows struck the ground wildly. But she knew they couldn't see. They were firing into the dark, night-blind from the fires. She pressed her back to the canyon wall for only a moment and looked at her brother who was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with fear. She grew suddenly afraid, knowing what happened whenever he felt fear like this. She saw some of her hairs begin to stand on end, and small sparks were coming off of Kit's body. She grabbed him by the face again, making him look up at her. "We can't stop now," she whispered to him. "We need to keep running. Understood?" He didn't respond. His eyes were searching, scanning, looking for a direction to flee. "Kit," she barked in a hoarse whisper, "if we don't move, they will kill us. If we don't stick together, they will kill us. We need to be brave, like Father. Got it?" She searched his gaze, seeing the tears welling up. "Kit!" Finally he nodded, holding back a sob with a deep breath. "Good. Run!" She grabbed his hand and took off into the darkness. The trees whipped at them and snow dug into their skin. The last light was fading now. To the children it felt like a curse, but in the darkness they would be able to run farther unseen. For now. They ran for what felt like hours. They tumbled down cliff walls, trying to make it to the base of the mountain, back to somewhere familiar. But they were met with ravine after ravine, and walls of trees like spikes holding them back. They were trapped. Her parents had left the carriage hours ago to mingle with the other nobles, and in the back of her mind all Rhea could think about was if they had gotten away. Had she lied to her brother when she told him they were fine? Of course not, she thought to herself. They had to be alive. They had to be. They were probably running just like her, lost just like her. Any moment now they would run into them and they'd all be safe. Together. Theron cursed himself for his carelessness as Mira pulled the crossbow bolt out of his shoulder. He winced and let out a breathy grunt as she tossed it onto the ground. "You should have known better," Mira scolded him. He spat some blood out, a fog filling the air as he did. His troops were huddled around the few fires scattered across the road. The fight was over. The mission was complete. But Theron couldn't get the images he saw out of his mind. He had expected warriors. He had expected a fight with equals. He'd expected evil. But what he got was children. He couldn't get their faces out of his mind. Mira knelt in front of him, trying to catch his gaze in hers, but he was lost in thoughts. "What's wrong?" she asked him under her breath. The kid, But he couldn't finish his thoughts. He put his head in his hands, pressing his fingers to his temples. "They ran into the storm. They'll die out there. It's done," she offered. He nodded his head, but his heart was screaming at him. He would have done anything for the Queen. Anything. But he felt as if he had just peeled back a curtain that had been holding back a void. He had been told that the mages were raised as warriors from a young age, that they were formidable and fearless and stood against everything that the Kingdom of Rain stood for. They were tyrants and demons. But what he saw were children that were no different than if he had had them himself. He could still see their smiles. He could still hear their screams. They lied to me. He felt a pain beyond the physical. Was he on the wrong side of the fight? Doubt crept into the corners of his soul. A cold sweat was developing on his forehead. He stood now, pushing aside the soldiers that were tending to him. "I'm fine," he barked. "Gather supplies, tend to the wounded. We move out in a few hours." He began to walk to the edge of the road as Mira stared at him curiously. After all these years, she could sense something was wrong. "What are you doing?" she asked quietly. "I can see that you're thinking." "I'm looking for them." He scanned the darkness far below him, his eyes squinting, grasping. "The kids?" she asked with a sigh. She spun in place, rubbing her eyes in frustration, but she knew she had to keep her voice down. "Theron, they're dead. If they didn't die tumbling down the cliffside, they'll die from the cold, or the wolves will get them. Leave them, Theron. It's over." She put her hand on his shoulder. "Theron. Theron, please. It's over." Theron turned to look at her. There was a sadness there that she had never seen. She opened her mouth to speak, but lost the words staring at him. She had seen Theron the soldier, Theron the forgiven, Theron the man. But she had never seen Theron the boy. And here he was looking back at her, lost like a child searching for answers. "I have to finish this." He locked eyes with her, grabbing her by both arms. He could feel the muscle underneath her tunic and thought momentarily about the years they spent training. He saw all of the years of their friendship laid out before him, and he winced. If he had known what he knew now before becoming a soldier, would their lives have turned out differently? Would they be together had they grown up in Alara? They could have had a home together, a life. But he knew what he had to do. "Theron, the troops. We just want to go home. Please." But Theron ignored her. Tears were welling up in his eyes now, and the sight of them silenced Mira. She had never seen him like this. She just stared at him, speechless. There was so much he wanted to say. He wanted to forsake everything. He wanted to lean in and kiss her. But he stopped himself. "I leave you in charge," he finished, and began the climb down. The whole way down, he could hear the children's names being screamed in his head. What had that kid done to him? Was it a ruse, some dark magic? Or was it simply his first glimpse at the truth? It was now fully dark. The sun was now below the horizon and would not rise again for many days. This was the worst-case scenario for Rhea and her brother, and Rhea knew that. But she wouldn't tell Kit. She couldn't. Kit hadn't spoken in almost an hour. They were just trudging through the snow quietly. "Don't worry about Mom and Dad. They'll find us," she said aloud finally. "Mm-hmm," Kit responded, staring at each foot as it disappeared in the snow. "They will," she repeated. But she wasn't sure if that was meant for him or for herself. She could feel the anxiety and fear creeping back in. She could still smell the smoke on her furs, the smell of flesh and blood in the air. She could hear the screams and see the blood running like streams over the snow, crimson puddles. She shut her eyes firmly, trying to push the images out of her mind, but they were burned into her eyelids. Tears streamed down her face now, and she wiped at them quickly, her breath fogging up the air. She heard a snap behind her, as if someone stepping on a twig or pushing through branches. "Mom? Dad?" she asked quietly, unconfidently. There was only silence. Their breath hung in the air. Then finally a figure stepped out from the shadows. A figure in armor. "Sir Killian?" she asked again. Then the figure drew their sword. "I found you, you little shits," an unfamiliar voice broke the silence. She saw his eyes first, glowing green, reflecting a ghost light in them. He was enchanted, she could tell, to see in the dark. Rhea screamed, putting herself between the stranger and her brother. "Please," she began. The soldier spat at her, blood staining the snow in front of her now. "Your lies won't get to me," he interrupted. "Your words are a veil, but I serve the Queen, and the Great Mother, and they will protect me tonight." He drew a dagger with his other hand. He stepped forward into what little light there was out here, his face contorted with rage. He was balding and thin, of small stature with a hooked nose. "Please," she begged again, softly now, tears running down her cheeks again. "Yeah, go on," he egged her on, his laughter filling the air. "Beg. Cry. Your people killed dozens of my men today." He stepped forward. The kids stepped back. Rhea sobbed now. It was over. They were gonna die here, in the middle of nowhere, so close to their destination. She would never get to live a life in the courts. She would never see her brother become a famous warrior. She would never see her parents again. She stared up at the sky for one last time. She looked at Altyrion, the great emerald sphere in the sky in all its beauty, swirls of red on a sea of green. She closed her eyes and squeezed her brother's hand. Then, the blade found its mark. She heard the grunt and felt the spray of blood. But it wasn't hers. She looked at her brother to see if he was okay, who was staring in shock. She followed his gaze and saw a blade in the throat of the assailant. His eyes were wide in shock. And with a sickening suction sound, the blade pulled back and his body crumpled to the ground, falling into the soft snow. Standing there in front of them was Theron. He was panting with tears streaked through a soot-stained face. The children didn't move. They just stared at him in shock. The dying soldier clutched at Theron, gurgling, drowning. Theron stared into the man's eyes with sorrow, and the man looked back with confusion and fear. He held the man's hand until he died. Then Theron rose and stood in front of them, now a great figure in armor, the silhouette of death in this forest. The enemy. Then what happened next, they didn't expect. "Run," he whispered to them. "Run," he ordered again. The children took a few steps back, confused. "Run! Come on!" And together, the three of them ran off into the snowy dark. Chapter 6. Search and Rescue. The Huddle in the Dark. The Trail of Blood. "Check again," Mira scolded. "We did, ma'am," the soldier offered meekly. "We found his body in the snow. There were 2 sets of footprints leading up behind him. We can track Rickon's set, but the other one, it came down from the mountain." He stopped to let her digest. 2 sets were there, where Rickon's body was found, and 3 sets ran off. They match his size. I refuse to believe that. What you are suggesting is treason. Heresy, she spat out. "Ma'am, the men saw Rickon fall off the side of the cliff. He must have fallen and survived. We can track exactly where he fell. We can follow his footprints to his body. And the other footprints..." He looked around at the others for help. Another soldier chimed in. "If it's not Theron, then the children had help. Either way, Theron is out there alone in the dark on a suicide mission, or he is the one that helped them," the soldier called Corin said. He was stroking a thick graying beard with his large, hairy hands. "No," she began again, shaking her head furiously. "Gods be damned, you're letting your emotions get in the way." Corin tested her, his own anger rising to match hers. Mira was pacing, but stopped when he spoke. The others knew he had made a mistake. She turned on her heel quickly, approaching him with the step of a predator. With a blinding speed, she swung at him, her knuckles cracking against his cheek. He immediately fell to the snow and shrunk in her shadow, blood dripping from his nose and lips. He looked up at her, angry and embarrassed, avoiding eye contact with everyone else. Everyone knew Theron had left her in charge. She was also easily one of the most gifted forgiven they had in the company, and few would dare challenge her the way Corin had. "I am forgiven," she said sharply, her hand resting threateningly at her scabbard. "I am not a fool, and I am not willing to accept that someone as devout as Theron suddenly decided to help the enemy, and one of them a curseborn at that." She clenched her jaw, her fists white at her sides. The rage was taking her, but a nagging feeling was gnawing at her insides. Theron should have returned hours ago. He should have checked in. He would have. She was sure of it. Had everything she had ever felt been nothing more than a pretense? An imaginary picture of a non-existent future in her head? But ma'am, we found a trail of blood near the tracks. It's possible that it belongs to the kids. Go on, she urged. Well, the kids were unhurt when they ran off. But what? She screamed. Everyone shrank from her growing anger. Theron, the crossbow bolt. So you think it's his blood? She scoffed. Her mind was racing. She could feel herself losing grip on what was true. Aye, ma'am, it could be his. It's consistent with his wound. It follows his tracks. At the very least, ma'am, it might lead us to him. If the enemy has charmed him or... the scout added cautiously. Damn that. It's his, you know it. We all know it. They got into his head and he betrayed us. We should leave them to die in the cold, Corin spoke up with a small group grunting in agreement. He began to rise from the ground, his confidence returning. Careful, Corin, she said slowly, her voice rattling with rage. You be careful. We're starting to think you've gone soft for Theron. He should never have left you in charge. I'm not the only one that feels it. Corin spun, wiping blood from his mouth and looking at the others. But Mira had already drawn her blade. It's about time we all start speaking our mind. We're tired of following you and that high-strung, low-born commander up and down. Mira silenced him with the blade through his gut. The silence that followed was long. She studied the eyes of each of her soldiers, a defiant look burning, challenging them. I am the commanding officer here. You would all do well to remember that you do not serve yourself. You do not find yourselves in foreign lands because of adventure. You are here for the Queen, for reign. We are here for the mission. Anyone who wishes to challenge that or threaten it is a hindrance we cannot afford. Understood. There were furious nods and yes ma'ams from everyone as Corin died at their feet. After everything we've been trained for, everything we have fought for, she laughed to herself, a laugh that frightened everyone else. No, we will not leave him. We will find him to learn the truth. Memories flooded her mind. She remembered the first time she showed her gift when she was barely 10 and 3 years old. She remembered her fear when one of her family members turned her in for being curse-born and the way they looked at her, afraid of her. She was taken away from her home within the week to be treated, to be forged into a weapon for the kingdom. She remembered the fear and disgust she felt for herself, the many hours of training she was forced into, and the choice to either excel or die. The running, the fighting, the sparring, all the time spent, all that blood spilled. Mira felt tears forming. She bit her tongue to quell them with pain. Anger. She met Theron the following summer after her first year of training at the Order of the Bastion, where all soldiers started. Theron's abilities had taken longer to manifest, and it took him even longer than her to adjust to life away from home. Even back then, it was obvious to her how afraid he was. And she was too. It wasn't long after that she would bring him flowers secretly to cheer him up. They would hold hands in the darkness when they should be sleeping. They had whispered their dreams to each other. She remembered how only hours ago they had talked about their future on that cliff. And she felt the pain in her heart swell. Theron and Mira had been there for each other when their whole world saw them as abominations. They were branded to remind everyone of their blood curse. They were sterilized so as to never pass on their defects. They had been forged in the fires of rain and turned into perfect soldiers. They had even graduated the Bastion together and went on to hone their magic with the other Forgiven. To them there was no friendship, only camaraderie. There was no home, there was only the crown. There were no dreams or hopes, only the mission. Mira opened her eyes and stared into the fire. The others were watching her hesitantly, waiting. He did not betray us. She spoke plainly, softly, not of his own free will. There was a long silence in the huddle in the dark. She heaved a great sigh and turned to continue pacing. This time, nobody challenged her. The flames cast their shadows into the trees and over the pile of corpses they had gathered. The air was pregnant with silence. Finally, she relented. "Fine. Follow the trail," she said shortly. "Take 10 Forgiven with you. We will finish here and join you soon. They can't have gotten far." The soldier bowed and quickly began selecting his volunteers. "And soldier," she spoke again. The soldier spun around at attention. "Ma'am, if you find Theron and he did indeed betray us, do nothing. Understood? You come find me." She spat some dried blood onto the snow and stared into the fire again. "Ma'am," he repeated quieter, slower. "Find him, so I can drive my blade through his skull myself." Chapter 7. The Children and the Traitor. The Oath in the Snow. "Hurry up," Theron winced, his wound aching in the cold. He had wrapped it in the darkness, but the pain had become sharper now. He could feel the warmth from the blood, a strange and welcome feeling in this bitter cold. The nights would only grow colder as the warmth of the sun dissipated. The cold was seeping into his bones, and he wanted nothing more than to sleep after having marched non-stop for the attack hours ago. He was feeling weary, and the children had noticed. "I can't believe I'm a traitor now," he muttered to himself. Rhea and Kit were walking a good way behind him, following only because they had no other choice. "We can't trust him," Rhea whispered under her breath. Kit nodded, hugging himself, trying to hold in the warmth like a blanket. The snow had started to fall heavier, the wind now adding to its ferocity. Rhea could see it in Kit's face. He was cold, tired, hungry, scared. For all she knew, they were walking back to the Rain camp. She couldn't risk it. "I could be back in Rain by now," he said, heaving a heavy sigh. She leaned in close to Kit to whisper in his ear. Ahead of them, Theron was pushing branches out of their way, using his sword, wincing with each swing. "When I say, we need to run into the forest," she warned. Kit looked up at her with fear, but did not protest. He nodded slowly, gulping. She nodded towards the darkness. "When I say," she prepped him. He nodded again, following her gaze. "Keep moving," Theron barked at them. He was starting to slow down, stopping to catch his breath creating a fog in the darkness. Rhea waited until he stopped, leaning against a tree. He was weak. If they were fast enough, they might make it. She locked eyes with Kit. "Run!" Together, the two broke off hand in hand and made a beeline for the trees and the darkness beyond. "Hey!" Theron called after them, but he only saw them disappearing when it was too late. "You've got to be..." he sighed. He brought his hands together. He quickly chanted under his breath, his hands moving in intricate motions. A stone around his neck glowed. Theron blinked, and a moment later his eyes were glowing the same eerie glow as the Rainian man he had dispatched to save the children's lives. "Come back!" he yelled into the darkness. Rhea and Kit huffed, sinking into the snow with each step. Already Rhea was exhausted, but she knew they couldn't stop. Not until they were safe. Not until they were home. "Go, Kit, go!" She ushered him on, but Kit's smaller frame was already lagging behind. She could hear Theron calling out to them not too far behind. He was catching up. She grabbed Kit's hand and put her finger to her lips, urging him to be quiet. They crouched, and in a split decision, she leaned them both against a tree. She covered both of their mouths and tried to shrink against the trunk, praying he would pass them. In moments, Theron had caught up. His eyes scanned the ground. "I'm not trying to hurt you. Although I should," he winced at the stupidity. He knew he shouldn't have added that last part, but he was frustrated and confused. Theron knew there was no going back. "Please, I know what it seems like. I see the armor I wear. You must be scared. But something changed. He sighed in the darkness. He stopped moving, following the tracks to the trees with his eyes. You're hundreds of miles from home. You're in the wilds at the most dangerous time of day. The long dark is no place for children. He waited for her response, but nothing came. Kit was looking at Rhea questioningly. She shook her head. Our report said you were heading to Portis. I can take you there, Theron pleaded. Kit once again searched his sister's eyes for answers. She shook her head more furiously. Theron dropped to his knees in the snow. He could see them. The spell made it easy. But he didn't want to startle them. He needed to be smart. The truth is, if I go back to my people, they will kill me. They're already sure to be following us. If you don't let me help you, we'll all die. Theron's voice trailed off. Why are you helping us? Kit called out, stepping out from the shadows. Theron's head lifted in his direction. You. I saw your memories. I saw your life. We were told you were possessed. We were told you were enemies. I was lied to. I can see that now. Theron stood and Kit stood his ground. You attacked us, Rhea finally gained the courage to step out of the shadows. I did, Theron conceded. How can we ever trust you? She asked, her anger rising. If you don't let me help you, my soldiers will find us. They will kill you without hesitation. They don't care that you are children. They see you as evil. He sighed and looked at his hands, which were stained with dried blood. I have done harm. I was raised as a weapon from the time I was younger than you are now. A tool for war. I was raised to believe I was less than human, that the only way to do good was to serve the crown. That's an excuse. I think I've always known the truth, part of me at least. How could everyone be evil when I carry the same blood in me that runs in your veins? I see you stand before me and I see the fear and innocence in you. I see it. How can all mages be evil when I know many within my own ranks who are better people than me? I think about all the lives I've taken in the name of the crown and I shudder now. There was a long pause. If getting you safely to your walls means I can help put even one small fraction of my deeds right, I must. Do you understand? I must. Theron thrust his sword into the snow and bent the knee. What are you? Kit began to ask. I, Theron Odengray, commander of the Black Company of the Forgiven of Rain, pledge my life to you, Vandren children. He looked up at the night sky, at the great swirling greens and reds of Alterian, at the stars that gleamed above them. I swear, by the gods that look down on me now, I will give my life for you, if it comes to that. I only ask forgiveness for my sins. I have been lied to. I have been led astray. I see the truth now. His eyes fell on them once more, tears glimmering like starlight under the ghostly glow of his spell. I will stop chasing you if you wish it. But you will more than likely die a most painful death. He locked eyes with Rhea, speaking almost directly to her. I swear to you, I will take you to the walls of Portis, if you'll have me. In the darkness, Rhea and Kit followed closely behind Theron, his sword hacked at the air, splitting branches that stood in their way. This way, he spoke softly. Before them was a large cave mouth. We need to rest. I need to heal. This is a good defensible spot. Rhea looked at the cave and turned to look at the mountains behind them. What if they find us? She said meekly. Unfortunately, my lady, if they choose to look for us, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. But we can't continue on foot in this state. You are hungry and slow. I need to patch my wounds. I will do what I can to hide us. He nodded towards the cave, and with some apprehension, the children followed each other inside. I need your boots, he said as they walked in. Our boots? Rhea looked down at the dirt-covered shoes that kept their feet warm. I'm going to make them think we went a different direction. Hopefully. Hopefully, Rhea asked. They are smart. We have to hope they take the bait. Begrudgingly, they relinquished their shoes, the cold air seeping into the warm wool that covered their feet. Theron returned outside. He sighed and began the slow work of covering their tracks. Unknown to him, his wound had reopened and his blood had stained the snow. Behind them, only a few miles away, a search party was closing in. Chapter 8. The Cave, the Promise, the Noise in the Dark. Can we start a fire? Kit begged, the cold wind howling through. The smoke would attract them, Theron offered simply. He had removed his armor and undershirt and was wrapping a fresh bandage around his chest and shoulder. That crossbow was a neat trick, he said to Rhea. She stuttered for a moment before he looked over at her with a small smile. Theron stood and tossed his fur-lined cloak to the children. Kit rushed to it, wrapping it around his body, leaving room for Rhea as she moved closer. What about you? Rhea asked. Aren't you cold? I have other ways to keep myself warm. He tapped a ring on his finger. It's not perfect, but I won't freeze to death. Rhea nodded. You know, for someone who thinks magic is evil, you sure do use a lot of it, she poked. As a Forgiven, we are trained to use all tools at our disposal, anything to get an edge over our enemies. He finished wrapping his wound, blood already staining the front. So everyone in Rain believes that magic is some sort of sickness? Kit asked, almost completely hidden under the massive black cloak. Theron nodded, putting his arms through his armor, wincing as he did. Legend says that long ago, the last of the demigod kings, Bolin the Abuser, asked a group of mages to help quell a rebellion. The mages declined. Rain fractured into what it is today, and our mistrust of mages exists to this day. He finished donning his armor. If you believe that, he said, lacing the front. Fractured, Kit repeated. You mean it became Alara? He replied. Theron nodded again. He replied solemnly with a nod. I see you know your history. But those are legends. You'll find that the truth is often much simpler. And what is the truth, then, sir? Just Theron, I'm a soldier, not a lord. And the truth, all anyone wants is power. I don't, Rhea retorted. Is that so? He scoffed as he tied his scabbard to his waist. So you would have no problem giving up your home, your castle, your fancy parties and your clothes, your servants? You would give it all to the less fortunate. Rhea didn't respond. She scrunched her face up, offended. See? The only ones who say they don't want power are the ones who already hold it. But I'm not evil, she replied hastily. I never said you were, my lady. Theron gave her a small bow. He walked towards the mouth of the cave. I'm going to scout ahead. Stay quiet. But we'll freeze, she retorted. With a single motion, Theron removed his finger and tossed it to her. Share it, he said simply. If I don't return, run the first chance you get. Without another word, Theron left them in the silence and the darkness of the cave with nothing but the howling wind for company. Theron crouched in the snow, walking slowly with intent, one foot after the other. He scanned the darkness looking for any movement, his senses heightened by his magic. As his gaze moved across the horizon, his eyes glowed like those of a cat caught in a light. Where are you? He whispered, asking nobody in particular. He knew he needed a better vantage point. Nimbly, he climbed the tallest tree he could see, his fingers aching from the cold as he moved from branch to branch. And he waited. Time moved slowly as he tried his best to warm himself. The temperature continued to drop, and he was beginning to feel the lack of sleep. It was almost 2 hours later when he heard the first signs of life. At first, he thought it was the kids, and he cursed them under his breath, as it was coming from the direction of the cave. He turned to look, and his heart dropped. He saw 10 figures moving in the snow. How had he missed them? Was he truly that tired? He pulled his bow off his back and aimed. With shaking hands, he loosed the first arrow. It struck one of the figures in the leg. Inside the cave, the kids heard the cry outside. Theron pressed himself against the tree trunk of the tree, using it as cover. He heard the soldiers fanning out, yelling orders. "Theron, is that you?" they called, but Theron didn't answer. "We're here to save you," the soldier continued. Theron recognized it as Ulrich's voice, one of the youngest commanders. He was a good fighter, strong with a sword, but he was a mediocre mage. Ulrich motioned to his men to spread out, but Theron's plan had worked. They were moving away from the cave. "Come out. Whoever shot the arrow, come out now and you'll be spared," he lied. Theron took a deep breath as he nocked another arrow. "You need to leave," Theron finally called out from his hiding place, his voice echoing. The men stopped and looked to their commander. "Theron? Whatever they've done to you, we can help. Mira is waiting for you," he called with genuine concern in his voice. Theron winced at her name. "We need our commander." "They have done nothing but shown me the truth," Theron replied, louder this time. He could hear the men fanning out again, moving deliberately, trying to pinpoint his location. "Ulrich, please. You have to listen to me," he sighed, trying to find the words. "We have all been lied to," he said softer. "I see." Ulrich breathed deeply. "Find him, he's been compromised," he whispered to his men. Theron knew what was coming. "Ulrich, they're just children, no different than if they had come from rain," Theron pleaded. "Theron, you're speaking madness. The crown will see you brought in by force if we must. Then I will do what I must. Last chance, Ulrich." But there was no response to Theron. Theron steeled himself and slowly crept out of cover and loosed another arrow. As he let go, he quickly hid behind the tree's foliage again. The arrow sunk into a soldier's chest, and he didn't get back up. Theron felt the weight of his betrayal, but there was no time to pity himself. He had made his decision. "He's in the trees," he heard them cry out. He needed to move. Theron nocked another arrow and took a deep breath. He came out from behind cover again and loosed another. It found its target, and another soldier fell to the snow without another word. "Take cover," he heard Ulrich cry out. Only 8 more. Each one he killed was a step further away from home. A step further away from the crown. From Mira. He let loose another arrow and jumped from the branches into the snow below. A fireball erupted around the top of the tree trunk. He felt the warmth collide with his leathers before dissipating. It was welcome warmth in the bitter cold, a shock of pain in a world of darkness. He bent his knees in the snow and rolled forward, springing back to his feet and running to the next tree. Another ball of fire erupted near him. He heard the others calling out, "Surround him!" Theron cursed under his breath. He slung his bow over his back and drew his blade. He took a deep breath and turned the corner, almost colliding with the soldier. "It's him," he heard them call out. "It's there!" But his words were cut short. Theron's training kicked in, and he drove his blade into the soldier's gut. He spun in place, pulling the blade out with a suctioning sound, and moved towards another. His blade clashed against another blade, and in 2 swings his sword met flesh. He felt hands grab him from behind and pull. Hard. His head hit the snow, cracking open on a rock. He felt his vision go white and a ringing in his ears overtake everything. This was it. This is how he was going to die. He must have imagined it, but a great light emanated from within the cave. And then all went dark. Chapter 9. The Savior in the Dark. They meet again. Run to Portus. The fury that erupted from the cave made Theron's semi-conscious mind stir, seeking to protect itself, at least until he saw what it was. There was a flash of light and a burst of wind that caused all the soldiers surrounding Theron to turn in awe. One of the soldiers was tossed into the air and impaled on a branch. The others began to shout as Theron slowly crawled away, a trail of blood following him. The trees at the entrance of the cave were ripped asunder, and the soldiers that tried to leave were suddenly frozen in place, unmoving. Theron could see the fear frozen in their eyes, unable to run, looking to anyone for hope, for an escape that never came. From within the cave, the young boy, Kit, emerged, hands outstretched. His hair was whipping around his face wildly, and his eyes were glowing a blinding white. There was a rage and terror on his face that shook even Theron to his core. His blurred vision focused on the boy, and his mouth dropped open in fear and amazement at the sheer power. Rhea turned the corner from the cave entrance, her mouth agape in fear, with a deep concentration on her face as she approached her brother cautiously. She shielded her face with her hands as she inched closer to him, step by step. There was more power in this boy than Theron had ever seen from even his most skilled soldiers. In moments, there was a clearing where once there was a patch of trees. The remaining soldiers that had once stood around Theron ready to kill him were now broken and shattered, scattered across the ground or in the trees. Then all was quiet again. Theron was laying on the ground panting, his body screaming at him in pain. The snow was melting under him and seeping into the crevices in his armor. Rhea hugged her brother, and Theron watched as Kit collapsed in her arms and began to sob. Rhea put him down at the cave entrance and rushed to Theron. Theron fought to keep his eyes open, and lost. When Theron's vision returned, he was in the cave again. There was a roaring fire going, and although he wanted to yell at the kids for their stupidity, he welcomed the warmth. "Don't move," he heard Rhea call to him. "You're badly injured," she continued, rushing to his side. She patted at his head with a warm rag. He winced in pain. "I've had worse," he said, stirring. The pressure from her hand was enough to keep him laying down, and he stopped arguing. "Kit," he asked quietly. "He's okay, he's sleeping right now." She looked over at her brother, who was curled up by the fire. "I know you said no fires, but it's okay," he said, locking eyes with her now. "You both saved me. You could have left me to die." There was a long pause. "What now?" Rhea asked. Theron sighed. "We need to get moving, and we need to go soon. The more time we spend waiting, the more dangerous it gets for us," he said, sitting up at last. His vision blurred as he did so, his head throbbing. "What do you mean?" she probed. He could hear the fear in her voice. "No time to explain. There will be others coming, much worse. Gather your things." "You're hurt," Rhea said softly, trying to get him to sit back down. "I'm fine," Theron said, standing with a grunt. "But you both won't be if we don't go, now." "The snow's only gotten worse," she added. "Good. It will hide us better. We're only 100 miles from the city. We can make it." But Theron wasn't sure Rhea believed him. Hell, he wasn't sure he believed himself, but what was he going to do? Wait in this cave for death? "You need to wake your brother. We'll move out in 30 minutes, understood?" Rhea didn't speak. She stared at him with a furrowed brow. "Rhea," he said, grabbing her by the shoulder firmly. "This is our only chance for making it out alive. Got it?" Finally, she nodded her head. "Good. Wake your brother. I need to sleep." They were on the move within the hour. The snow was falling heavily, and the winds had picked up ferociously. Theron lagged behind with a sword in hand, cursing himself for having slept too much, keeping a watch on the children from afar. Rhea had his cloak, and Kit had his ring, leaving Theron to face the bitterness of the setting sun and the wild winds that came with the long nights. He felt the blanket of cold envelop him, but he had no time to think or feel. Chances were he would not make it out alive. Even if he could make it to the walls of Portus with the children, they would kill him on sight for the armor he wore. He pushed the thought out of mind and forced himself to take another step, and another step, and another. Occasionally, Rhea would glance back to see if he was there, and he would gesture for her to keep going. Theron watched Kit, remembering the quick moments that came to him from the night before. How could such a small child contain so much power? How had he taken out so many trained warriors like they were nothing but dolls? Theron was astounded, and after having witnessed what he had, he felt now more than ever that he was walking the right path. An arrow suddenly sank into his shoulder, almost exactly in the same spot as the bolt that had struck him only hours ago. He toppled to one knee and howled in pain. The children turned to look at him as a lone figure stood behind them in the distance. The wind and snow obscured them. All he could make out was the dark flowing cloak and the long bow that they were already knocking another arrow onto. Theron didn't have to see their face to know who it was. "Mira," he whispered under his breath. She raised her bow in his direction as he pulled the arrow out of his back. He turned to the kids and spoke into their minds. "Run." The children took off into the darkness. Mira took another step towards him. She loosed an arrow, and with a swift motion he brought up an invisible barrier that warbled with light as the arrow struck it, shattered in multiple directions. "Mira," he called out. "Traitor," she responded. He could hear the pain in her voice. She knocked another arrow. "Mira, please, listen to me." Another arrow went flying towards him. Again, it shattered against his shield. "There's more happening here than we understand. Our leaders have lied to us. They've failed us. If you'd seen what I have seen, you would understand," he begged. "I will never understand the pain you have put me through, Theron. You are not forgiven. You are not of Rain. You are a beast, a foul creature that deserves the death that is coming." She hurled words at him, walking slowly towards him. He put his sword away and held his hands up as he once again broke another arrow against his barrier. They were within 10 feet of each other now. He could see she was crying. "Please, Mira," he said over the howling of the wind. She winced, biting back her sobs. Now that she could see his face, she couldn't bring herself to loose another arrow. She swung her bow with all her might, and it cracked against his armor. In a single motion, he pulled her into a hug. He felt her warmth. He felt the sanctuary of her arms cradle him. She fought him, beating him against his chest, and then she stopped. She sobbed into his shoulder. "How could I ever betray you, Mira?" he whispered. All she could repeat was "why?" over and over again. "You have to let me go," he finally said, breaking the silence. "I should kill you," she whispered. Then, without warning, she pulled him into a kiss. He pulled her in harder, melting into her. How cruel a world for him to finally get what he dreamed of his whole life, only to have to walk away from it. When he pulled away, he looked at her and put his forehead to hers. "Mira," he began, but the words didn't come out. "Me too," she returned. Theron glanced back at the tree line. There, both children's faces were poking out from behind a tree, watching them, waiting to see if their fate was sealed or not. "Mira, they're just kids," he begged. "They're children. They just want to go home." Mira held Theron's hand and walked to his side. She put her hand up slowly and waved to them. Then she sighed, a sad and heavy sigh. "Go," she muttered with the cold voice of a commander he had known his whole life. He didn't say anything else. He held her hand until he was too far to hold it anymore. With one last glance back, he felt the pain of walking away from the one safe space he had ever felt his entire life. She stood there in the snow until he was out of sight. When he was gone, she collapsed in the snow and cried. Chapter 10. 8 hours. One more step. The final mercy. With every step they took, Theron knew there was no turning back. There was far too much blood on his hands now. Mira had seen him helping the enemy with her own eyes. She wouldn't be able to lie, not to her troops. And even if she did, his people would still send others looking for, at best, answers after losing so many men, and at worst, retribution. The snow was getting thicker with each passing hour. Harder to walk through. Harder to keep their bearings. Theron had jogged ahead to keep the children close. He had taken one of his tinctures. The blood-red mixture went down like a tangy, acidic spice, and had helped heal some of his wounds. The nap he had taken had helped, but he knew the kids would be slowing down. He also knew if they stopped, they would die. So he kept them moving. He kept pushing them, picking them up. All the while, the darkness surrounded them like a thin veil that kept back the predators he knew were out there. Every couple hours he stopped, finding a large tree for cover and letting them sleep. He could hear the beasts and predators lurking in the shadows, coming out of their sleep, hungry. He kept low and he kept quiet. They were so close to the city. If his bearings were right, they were snaking along a small mountain road, and in 8 hours or so they could be within sight of the city. 8 hours is all that separated them from life and death. They would hate him for pushing them this hard now, but they would thank him later. Theron thought of his home in Rain. He thought of the familiar smell of his barn, the feel of the warm fire, the thought of a life he could have had with Mira. That is what kept him going. After a while, he stirred the children. He spoke little, and they didn't press him. Instead, they whispered to each other. Most of the time, Rhea was offering Kit small words of comfort, but here or there she made him smile, made him laugh. Theron could see the love she had for her brother. He saw the affection in her eyes, and when Kit wasn't looking, the worry and fear she also carried, knowing the strength that lay buried within him. Hours flew by like snow in the wind. "I can't," Kit finally said. "You must." That was all Theron said. "I'm tired. I haven't slept. I haven't eaten." "Listen to me, little lord," Theron spoke softly, placing a hand on Kit's shoulder as he kneeled in front of him. "You will be a warrior one day. I was not much older than you when I began my training. The first thing you must learn is that you are much more capable of incredible feats than you think. Your mind, it shuts down sooner than your body. You can make it. You can because you must." Theron looked into his eyes with a fire that had gone out since walking away from Mira. "Your sister needs you to be strong," he offered. "She does?" "Aye. If you stop, she stops. And if you both stop, I have to stop. And if we all stop, we die," he warned. "We are almost there. Soon we will be cresting over these white hills, out of the forest and into a rising sun with your great city in the distance. Then it is only a short walk before you're safe behind your stone walls." "What about you? Won't you be walking with us?" Kit asked, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "I don't think your soldiers will take kindly to me." "I'll tell them everything you did for me," Kit said with a small smile. "I'll make them trust you." Theron smiled wide. "If only it were that easy," he chuckled, squeezing his shoulder. "You have shown me more kindness and taught me more in a few short hours than all I thought I knew in all the years I have lived. Thank you. Thank you both." Theron stood again, snow falling from his knees. "We keep going. Just a little longer, aye?" "Aye," he sighed. "Good. How much longer exactly?" Kit asked, his brows turned down at the ends, giving him the look of a sad puppy. "Just one more step. Just one more. And one more after that," Theron offered with a warm smile. Kit nodded sadly, but smiled back, just a little. As Theron turned, he saw Rhea looking at him with a melancholy smile. She nodded at him with a small thank you on her lips. Theron nodded in return. He didn't know it yet, but death was closing in on them faster than they knew. "Tell me about your home," Rhea asked, the snow parting for them as they walked. "What do you wish to know?" Theron replied. "Where do you live? In the city?" "I do, just outside." He gave her a sideways glance. He noticed the way her mind seemed to be turning. He wondered what she must be thinking. "Do you miss it?" "I do," he replied, softer now. He didn't wait for her to prompt him. "My home is not unlike yours, although yours is probably much bigger," he laughed. Have you ever been to Alara? She cried a little more. Yes. Not as a visitor. Oh, she contemplated. I think you'd like it, she said after a moment. I'm sure I would, he sighed. Do all of you live in the same place? We live across the country. We come to the palace when we are called, but when we're not needed, we have our homes and land given to us by the Queen. When was the last time you were home? More than a year ago now. Seems we're always needed, he jested, but there was a heaviness in his voice. You told me earlier that there were others coming after us. Worse than you. She paused. He waited. Do they also live with you? Our country is small. It's not the vast kingdom it once was. The ones who are hunting us live across the country. They're few in numbers, but great in strength. Can you tell me about the ones who are coming after us? Rhea asked meekly. Assassins. Killers, unlike any I've ever met, he whispered out of earshot of Kit. Are they truly that terrible? Theron stopped walking. My lady, where I second-guessed my actions after meeting you, from them there will be no hesitation. He glanced at her for a moment. None. She nodded. Was all she said. They wear masks of solid metal. Hidden amongst flowing robes of black, they move like shadows faster than the wind on steeds that, legends say, are born of the hills. Her brow was furrowed in concern, but she stayed strong like a true lady of the courts. He admired her courage. Few her age would take this challenge on like she had. And what will you do if they find us? She finally asked. I will hold them off while you run, and I will pray that I can hold them all. And do you think you could hold them? He heard the fear in her voice. I will do my best. I swore to you I will give my life if that's what it comes to. I swore it. So I will. Are they forgiven, like you? No. He shook his head. There's something else. And what do they call themselves? Theron betrayed the tension and fear he had been trying to hide when he looked at her. She had seen so much now, she deserved the truth. He wished now more than ever that he had been born under different circumstances. He wished he had been born a normal citizen of Rain with no gift, no curse, just a farmer. But as he pondered this thought, he wondered how different the last few hours would have been in that world. Would the Forgiven have attacked the caravan tonight? Would the children have died in the attack? He was here now with one purpose, to guide. He believed it now. They are the final mercy, he said, and with that he took just one more step, and then one more. Mere hours away, horses galloped closer with a furious might. Chapter 11. A Prayer in the Shadows. Horses in the Snow. The Red Cloak. The riders had stopped to let their horses rest. All 8 of the riders wore identical black robes that covered them from head to toe. Their boots and gloves were solid leather that shimmered in the tiny traces of planet light that peeked through the clouds. Their faces were veiled by silver masks, each identical to the last, bearing the face of a woman wreathed in flames. Their leader was bent over in the snow, examining some tracks as the horses chewed on grass that poked up through the snow. They had received word, only hours ago, of a traitor in the mountains on their way home from another mission. They had redirected almost immediately and without rest, and pursued the trail where they met a detachment of Forgiven led by a woman. She had been vague with her directions, but they needed only to follow the trail of bodies to find their way. The footprints had all but diminished, but the direction was clear. They were heading towards Portis, at the base of the mountains on the border. There was nowhere else for the traitor to take them. But time to catch them was running out, and they could not disappoint the Queen. They must not. The officer stood, wiping snow off their gloves. "We're close," he spoke firmly, his deep voice metallic behind the mask. "Only a few hours." "They can't have gone far. Not with the children in tow," one of them, a woman, spoke. "They are nobles of Alara, and one of them, I am told, carries the god plague," the leader confirmed. "The children must die." "And what of the traitor?" another asked. Their leader sighed. "Theron is to be brought back alive, preferably. However, if he resists, we bring back his head." There was some nodding in the group. "May our mercy come quickly," the leader finished. "May our mercy come quickly," the others replied in unison. They waited for only a few more minutes before they jumped back into their saddles and pushed the horses through the snow. They were gone from that clearing within minutes, and riding into the dark. From behind the tree, a red cloak appeared as soon as they were gone. A warrior in Alaran armor pressed himself against the tree. Standing there, beaten and bloodied, having survived a fall from the cliff, was Sir Killian. His graying beard was speckled with snow, and the once handsome face was masked behind grime and blood. "The kids," he muttered. He sighed under his breath, coughing up some blood. "Someone took them. I have to save them," he said, spitting into the snow. "Gods, hear me." He dropped to one knee. "Give me the strength to make haste towards my enemies. You have spared my life. Now I ask that you give it meaning." He bowed his head in prayer and pulled the fur-lined cloak closer to him, trying to hide from the cold that was trying its best to make him give up there and now. The first hours of the night were always the coldest as the winds picked up. The storm would only grow worse, that much was sure. But he didn't have time to think about the cold, or to think about hunger, or pain, or home. He thought of the kids. He thought of their parents and the promises he had made to them. He thought of Rhea's smile and Kit's laugh. He'd watched them grow for years now, and he had sworn himself to their service. He wished now that they had never left the castle near the capital. He wished he could pick them up and just take them to simpler days. His eyes shut and winced at the thought of them. He clenched his fists, the snow crunching beneath them. The enemy had taken everything from him. But he had survived. He was fated to come to this spot, at this moment. Why else would the gods spare him? Why not kill him with the others? No. He had survived for a reason. He knew it. He stood now and stared into the dark, clouded sky. Then, as if suddenly struck with a sense of purpose, and as if all pain had been shed, he began a steady pace in the direction of the riders and towards the great city of Portus.